When a commercial aircraft crashes into the sea without warning, the world holds its breath for answers. We place our trust in experts, air crash investigators, engineers, forensic analysts to gather the facts, analyze the wreckage, decode the black boxes, and deliver a conclusive report. But what happens when even the experts can't agree on what happened? When the evidence splits the story in two. EgyptAir Flight 804 didn't just vanish into the Mediterranean Sea. It left behind a mystery that fractured international cooperation and raised questions no one wanted to ask. It was the early morning of May 19, 2016, EgyptAir Flight 804, an Airbus A320, was cruising at 37,000 feet over the Mediterranean. On a routine red-eye flight from Paris to Cairo, everything appeared normal until Greek air traffic controllers attempted to hand off communications to Egyptian airspace. The call was met with silence. Just minutes later, the aircraft's transponder disappeared from radar, but the plane hadn't exploded, and it hadn't disintegrated, not yet. For 9 more agonizing minutes, the aircraft spiraled downward in a steep and chaotic descent, one that no one on board could have survived. All 66 people, 56 passengers, and 10 crew were killed when the jet smashed into the sea and sank to a depth of nearly 3,000 meters. Most of the wreckage remains there to this day, under international aviation law, specifically Annex 13 of the Chicago Convention. The responsibility for investigating an accident falls to the country where it occurs. But when a crash takes place over international waters, the responsibility transfers to the country of aircraft registration. That made Egypt as the operator and registration country of the Airbus A320, the lead investigative authority. But Annex 13 also requires the involvement of the state of design and manufacture, in this case France, since Airbus is a European consortium headquartered in Toulouse. The French BEA, known for its precision and technical depth, assembled a team of experts and engineers from Airbus and sent them to Cairo to assist the Egyptian Aircraft Accident Investigation Directorate, or EAID. For the first few weeks, the cooperation was smooth. The French and Egyptian teams worked together to recover wreckage, analyze radar data, identify remains, and extract the flight recorders. But then came the turning point. The Egyptian authorities announced that traces of TNT trinitrotoluene, a military-grade explosive, had been found on several of the bodies. This, they said, was evidence of sabotage, a terrorist act. The narrative changed overnight. Egypt no longer treated the crash as an accident, but as a deliberate bombing. The EAID handed over control to state prosecutors, and the black boxes were withheld from international review. But France was not convinced. The BEA raised questions. If the plane had exploded, why were there no signs of an in-flight breakup on the radar? Why did the descent last 9 minutes, rather than the rapid fall associated with mid-air explosions? And why was there no evidence of blast trauma, pitting, or metallic penetration on the wreckage typically seen in bombings like Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie or Metrojet 9268 over Sinai? In those cases, forensic analysis confirmed the explosion within hours. Here, nothing matched that pattern. Moreover, TNT residue can be easily introduced through contamination, especially when bodies are recovered by naval ships using shared equipment or stored near explosive handling materials. So the investigation split in two. Egypt maintained the theory of terrorism. France leaned toward a technical malfunction or onboard fire. The absence of a conclusive final report only deepened the mystery. To understand what may have really happened, we need to rewind to the last known facts, starting with the flight itself. Flight 804 was lightly booked that night, carrying 56 passengers and an unusually large crew of 10, including 3 security officers. That wasn't typical for an A320 flight, but it made sense. Just 2 months earlier, another EgyptAir A320 had been hijacked, en route from Alexandria to Cairo, by a man wearing a fake suicide belt. The aircraft was diverted to Cyprus. No one was harmed, but the psychological impact lingered. EgyptAir had since increased security on its flights, particularly on high-profile international routes. The flight was commanded by a 36-year-old captain with over 600 flight hours, including 100 on the Airbus A320. His first officer, just 25, had joined EgyptAir at the minimum legal age of 20. Despite his youth, he had logged nearly 3,000 hours, nearly all on the A320. Both pilots were regarded as competent, healthy, and cleared for duty. No red flags, no distress signals, no warnings, just silence, until the plane began its fatal descent. To this day, EgyptAir Flight 804 remains a case suspended between two narratives, one of terror and one of tragedy. But the real story, buried in data smoke and deep-sea wreckage, demands more than politics or speculation. It demands that we understand the systems, the signals, the cockpit, and the human decisions behind those final 9 minutes. Before takeoff, the flight crew of EgyptAir 804 would have gone through their usual preparations, reviewing dispatch documents, checking the route forecast, and inspecting the aircraft's technical logbook. Weather conditions that night were benign, with only scattered clouds reported along the entire route to Cairo. In other words, it should have been a smooth ride over the Mediterranean. The technical log showed minor issues from the previous week, some faulty lights, a few sticky valves, but all had reportedly been resolved. Nothing stood out. Nothing to suggest that this flight would be any different from the thousands that had come before it. Yet, after the crash, troubling details began to surface. Unconfirmed media reports hinted at a trail of ACAR's fault messages from the aircraft during its prior flights, dozens, possibly hundreds of system alerts that never made it into the official tech log. This raised serious questions. Was the plane quietly failing in ways the crew never formally recorded? Or were those signals merely routine transient faults that occur on every commercial jet? In aviation, what's not written down can be just as important as what is. If the logbook was incomplete, investigators would be flying blind. At 21:21 UTC, the aircraft began its departure from Paris. The A320's CFM56 turbofan engines roared to life as the pilots pushed the thrust levers forward. The plane accelerated smoothly down the runway and climbed into the night sky, authorized to ascend to flight level 37,000 feet. The flight coasted through European airspace without incident. It passed over Switzerland, glided along the Adriatic, and approached Greek airspace. All appeared calm. Inside the cockpit, the flight crew was relaxed. The cockpit voice recorder, CVR, captured casual chatter, ambient music, and normal conversation. During this stretch, a passenger began to feel unwell. Flight attendants entered the cockpit periodically to update the pilots. The idea of diverting was discussed, but ultimately dismissed. The condition was manageable. This wasn't uncommon. Medical issues like turbulence are routine matters at cruising altitude. Later in the flight, the crew received their meals. Lasagna. It seems an oddly human detail amidst a tragedy. The captain complained of feeling a bit cold. He asked a flight attendant for a blanket and pillow, which she promptly delivered. The exchange was casual, familiar. One of the pilots even offered the jump seat. Then came the moment everything changed. At exactly 00:25:24, a sudden violent explosion rocked the aircraft. The source, a catering cart located in the forward galley, just behind the cockpit on the right side of the aircraft. Though not powerful enough to tear the plane apart instantly, the blast caused catastrophic damage to the galley forward fuselage and nearby systems, including the crew oxygen system. That system, critical during any cockpit fire or depressurization, became the very fuel for the inferno that followed. The explosion ignited nearby materials, curtains, packaging, plastic fixtures, and the breached oxygen lines supercharged the flames. Within seconds, the fire surged forward. The cockpit crew scrambled. One asked for a fire extinguisher, but by then, the fire had breached containment and was burning too hot too fast. In less than a minute, They lost control. Meanwhile, the aircraft's automated systems began broadcasting fault messages via ACARS, Aircraft Communications, Addressing, and Reporting System. These were rapid-fire alerts sent directly to EgyptAir's maintenance center. The sequence was chillingly similar to a prior incident in 2005. Helios Airways Flight 522, a Boeing 737 failed to pressurize, and the lack of oxygen incapacitated the crew. The plane continued on autopilot until it ran out of fuel. In both cases, a cascade of system failures offered fleeting clues, none of which were fully understood until it was too late. What's remarkable is that those ACARS messages from Flight 804 were sent before the final dive. They captured smoke alarms from both the lavatory and the avionics bay, the electronic heart of the aircraft. Next came failures in the flight control computer, the spoiler system, and the rudder travel limiter, a critical safeguard that prevents overstressing the tail at high speeds. In less than 3 minutes, the aircraft went from cruising steadily at 37,000 feet to becoming a fire-engulfed, spiraling descent into darkness. And all of it began with one explosion. But whether that explosion was caused by a bomb or something else remains the most hotly contested mystery of EgyptAir Flight 804. After the suspected explosion on EgyptAir Flight 804, what followed was a technical meltdown, unlike anything normally seen in mid-air emergencies. Within 44 seconds of the initial blast, a silent stream of distress signals began transmitting from the Airbus A320. These weren't mayday calls or radio transmissions from the pilots. There were none of those. Instead, these were cold, automatic digital fault reports relayed by the aircraft's ACARS system, the communications addressing and reporting system designed to give maintenance teams a head start. ACARS sent each fault directly to EgyptAir's operations center on the ground in real time. The first signal, smoke in the forward lavatory. Then came a series of cascading errors. A fault in the right-hand sliding window sensor, an issue with the anti-ice system. Then smoke detected in the avionics bay, the nerve center of the aircraft's electronics, located just beneath the cockpit. Next, it was the flight control computers. Specifically, Flight Control Unit Number 2 and the spoiler elevator computer. 3 both critical to the plane's fly-by-wire system, which electronically manages flight surfaces in place of traditional hydraulic or cable linkages. Then came the avalanche. Within just 19 seconds, multiple core systems collapsed. The traffic collision avoidance system failed. Rudder pedal position sensors gone. Additional flight control computers and spoiler systems reported errors. Even the weather radar and the electronic engine control computer for engine number 2 registered faults. One by one, the backbone of the aircraft's control systems began to fail. By 002929 UTC, the autopilot disengaged automatically. But what was more concerning, disturbing even, was what didn't happen. There was no indication that the pilots took manual control. No flight path correction. No mayday, no input. Seconds later, the flight data recorder stopped recording. At that exact moment, the aircraft was still level, holding steady at 37,000 feet, and beginning a gentle left turn. Nothing that indicated an immediate descent. 9 seconds after that, the cockpit voice recorder fell silent too. All traces of the crew vanished. The Egyptian investigative team concluded that the explosion fire and toxic smoke likely incapacitated the pilots rapidly within seconds, either through burns injury or unconsciousness caused by smoke inhalation. With the autopilot off and no human intervention, the aircraft was now unpiloted. A 130-ton jetliner flying blind. The loss of transponder signals at the same time meant that secondary radar, used by air traffic controllers to track altitude identity and speed, could no longer detect the plane. From the controller's perspective, it simply disappeared. But primary radar, which works by reflecting radio waves off physical objects, kept tracking it. It showed something deeply unsettling. The plane began to enter a spiraling right-hand turn. Not a sharp dive, but a tightening corkscrew motion, one that would eventually lead to a high-speed uncontrolled descent at 003850. Just over 9 minutes after the CVR stopped recording, EgyptAir 804 vanished from radar completely, but the aircraft wasn't entirely silent. Somewhere during the fall, it triggered its emergency locator transmitter ELT, a device that's supposed to activate upon a sudden deceleration exceeding 2 Gs typically at the moment of impact. Oddly, the ELT signal was detected 2 minutes before the aircraft actually hit the water. That anomaly raised a new theory. Perhaps a second internal explosion occurred during descent strong enough to jolt the aircraft and trigger the ELT. If true, it would suggest not just an initial blast near the cockpit, but another detonation midair. In their final analysis, Egyptian authorities anchored their conclusion on the presence of TNT residues found on victims' bodies, an explosive compound not used in any component of the Airbus A320. In their view, the only plausible source was a deliberate detonation of an explosive device. The Egyptians further argued that the blast originated from the forward galley. Their reasoning was based on the sequence of smoke alerts. The lavatory smoke sensor tripped, first followed by the one in the avionics bay, implying the fire began closer to the lavatory. Recovered fragments from the front right fuselage and the business class cabin bore signs of heat exposure, sooting charring and metal curling outward, all classic forensic signatures of a contained blast. In addition, a separate forensic report by Egypt's Attorney General included grim detail fragments of structural material were embedded in human remains, suggesting forceful shrapnel consistent with an internal explosion. But the French BEA wasn't convinced. They questioned the chain of custody for the evidence, the potential for contamination, and the absence of pressure wave patterns on the fuselage skin. They pointed out the lack of physical trauma consistent with traditional explosives, and the lack of an explosion signature on the CVR. No loud bang, no sudden decompression, and the flight's strange behavior, post-blast, smooth altitude, soft turns, wasn't consistent with an airframe twisting bomb. So, two versions of the same story were born, one rooted in forensic fragments and TNT residue, the other in black box data and systemic logic. But both began at the same point, a quiet night over the Mediterranean, until everything fell apart. As investigators combed through the wreckage of EgyptAir Flight 804, they came upon several catering trolleys, twisted, crushed, and folded in ways that seemed unnatural, even for a high-speed impact. To the Egyptian investigators, this was the smoking gun. In their final report, the Egyptian Aircraft Accident Investigation Directorate EAID concluded that such deformation could only have been caused by the force of a powerful explosion. And not just that, a hissing noise captured on the cockpit voice recorder at the exact moment the chain of system failures began was interpreted as the sound of oxygen escaping, a detail that significantly altered the scope of the event. The EAID argued that this explosive event had breached the crew oxygen system, creating an oxygen-rich environment that rapidly fed the fire. In their view, the initial blast, possibly from an explosive device in the forward galley, ignited materials near the oxygen lines, accelerating a fire that overwhelmed the cockpit. The fire then reached a critical electrical panel mounted in the right rear section of the cockpit, a hub that controlled many of the aircraft's primary systems. This cascading failure, they claimed, led to the autopilot disengaging, and with the crew incapacitated or already dead, the flight path became uncontrollable. To support their conclusion, Egyptian investigators pointed to a single central claim. There were no mechanical or system issues before the explosion. That meant, in their eyes, the fire and failures could only be explained by sabotage. But is that the full story? And more importantly, is it the right one? Because in one of the most striking counterpoints ever issued in civil aviation history, the French BEA flatly rejected this conclusion. In its comments on Egypt's final report, the BEA went further than most agencies would ever dare, in diplomatic language. It stated that the factual accuracy of the report is questionable, and that the reasoning appears to distort the facts. For investigators, such language is nothing short of an earthquake. So what exactly did France and numerous outside experts find so troubling? To understand that, we have to revisit how bombings are normally investigated. In incidents like Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie or Malaysia Airlines, Flight 17 investigators went to extraordinary lengths to recover and reconstruct the wreckage. Each twisted panel, each hole in the fuselage was mapped and analyzed to understand how the explosion propagated through the structure. They didn't just rely on chemistry, they relied on forensic physics. One of the key markers in a bombing is what's called micro-pitting, tiny impact points, where high-energy fragments strike nearby surfaces. Another is blast patterning, a directional signature, showing how the force radiated outward. In Lockerbie, they even tracked fragments of the bomb casing embedded in a passenger seat. In both cases, chemical traces were only one part of the evidence puzzle. In the case of Flight 804, however, the Egyptian investigators had only a sliver of the wreckage and virtually none of the critical fuselage structure needed to reconstruct a blast pattern. Without reassembly, the argument that skin panels were curled outward becomes meaningless. Panels can deform in almost any direction during a violent ocean crash. Context is everything, and context was missing. More tellingly, the cockpit voice recorder didn't include the distinctive acoustic signature of an explosion. No bang, no shockwave. Just a hissing sound, likely the onset of the oxygen leak itself. And that's not a minor oversight. In real explosive decompressions, like the Southwest Airlines Flight 1380 engine failure in 2018, the sound is unmistakable, and cabin altitude warnings blare loudly within seconds. But in Flight 804's recording, the aircraft remained pressurized for 4.5 minutes after the alleged blast. No warning tone, no decompression alert. That silence matters. It strongly suggests that whatever initiated the fire, it didn't breach the fuselage. If it had, the system would have immediately detected the pressure drop. And then, there's the mystery of the bomb itself. 8.5 years later, no one has claimed responsibility. No suspects have been arrested, indicted, or even publicly named. This is extremely rare in cases of terrorism. After the Metrojet 9268 bombing over Sinai, ISIS claimed responsibility within hours. In Lockerbie, suspects were named and tried even decades later. But here, nothing, not even speculation. Even more glaring is what's absent in the Egyptian report. No explanation for how the bomb got on board, no timeline, and no theory for who might have planted it. Not a passenger, not a crew member, not a ground operative, not even an unclaimed bag. It's as though a bomb simply appeared with no cause, no plan, and no perpetrator. And so the narrative splits again. One side sees a deliberate act of terror, justified by traces of TNT and distorted metal. The other sees a technical failure and fire rooted in the physical evidence and the timeline of systems collapse. The truth, it seems, is buried somewhere between the D. The deeper investigators dug into the wreckage of Flight 804, the clearer the divide became. The French BEA and independent experts were growing increasingly skeptical of Egypt's conclusions. According to them, the Egyptian final report had worked backward, starting with the assumption that the TNT residue found on the bodies must have come from a bomb, then constructing a theory that bent the rest of the evidence to fit that conclusion. This, the BEA warned, was a fatal inversion of proper investigative logic. You don't start with a theory and make the facts fit. You start with the facts and see where they lead. In their comments to the media, the BEA went further. They cast doubt on the very presence of TNT to begin with. Considering that the bodies had been submerged in seawater for weeks, any traces of explosive residue, particularly something like TNT, should have dissolved entirely. Its persistence was scientifically questionable, if not outright impossible. So if a bomb didn't bring down EgyptAir 804, what did? The shift came when the Egyptian government reclassified the crash as a criminal case. The moment traces of TNT were reported, the investigation was stripped from the hands of the EID and transferred to the Egyptian Attorney General's office. From that point on, the French BEA lost access. Egypt's cooperation froze. But not before the BEA had downloaded the flight data and voice recordings. And based on that data, they began to piece together a very different story. One far more plausible and far more disturbing. To understand the BEA's alternate theory, we need to look closely at a system rarely discussed outside of training manuals: the crew oxygen system on the Airbus A320. In every pressurized aircraft, oxygen backup is mandatory. If the cabin were to depressurize at cruising, altitude passengers would rely on oxygen masks that drop from the overhead panels. These masks, however, only supply about 12 minutes of oxygen, just long enough for the plane to descend to breathable altitudes. But for pilots, the need is different. They may need to manage a crisis at 37,000 feet, or navigate an emergency descent. So the crew oxygen system is designed to provide oxygen for hours, not minutes. It begins with a large pressurized oxygen cylinder, typically located beneath the forward left fuselage of the aircraft. This canister feeds 4 full-face masks, each stored in compartments behind or beside the cockpit seats. These masks aren't passive like the ones in the cabin. They are activated the moment they're pulled out. When a pilot flips open the storage cover and tugs on the red handle, 2 things happen simultaneously. The mask deploys and a solenoid valve opens, allowing oxygen to flow through flexible tubing to the mask. That same movement also activates the built-in microphone, linking it to the cockpit voice recorder and allowing communication through the intercom and radios even in chaos. The mask itself is more than just a breathing aid. It's also a protective barrier against smoke. In normal operation, the oxygen mixes with cabin air, or can be switched to pure oxygen. But if the cockpit fills with smoke, like in the case of a fire, pilots can switch to positive pressure mode. This setting floods the mask with continuous oxygen at 5 bar pressure, pushing back against toxic fumes and creating a seal around the pilot's face. A separate emergency button allows for a short burst of high-pressure oxygen, but only while it's held down. The system is sophisticated, but it's also vulnerable because it relies on a network of metallic tubing valves and fittings snaking through the aircraft, particularly through the forward fuselage and galley area. Any breach or leak could have devastating consequences, and this is where the BEA's theory begins to gain traction. Their engineers conducted a series of tests and simulations using data from the flight data recorder. Based on the timing of fault messages, cockpit voice activity, and structural failures, they proposed that the initial event on Flight 804 may not have been an explosion at all, but rather a failure or ignition of the crew oxygen system itself. Whether it was a leak, a rupture, or an overheated electrical component igniting flammable material in the oxygen-rich forward galley, the result would be the same: a fast-burning fire fueled by pure oxygen racing through critical systems. This fire, not a bomb, could explain the rapid systems collapse recorded in the ACARS stream. It would also explain why the CVR captured the hissing sound of escaping gas, not the concussive blast of an explosion, and it would account for the absence of a decompression alarm. If the oxygen-fed fire stayed confined to the forward cabin and didn't rupture the fuselage, the aircraft could remain pressurized, even while burning from the inside. For the BEA, this was the most rational conclusion. But with the criminal investigation taking precedence in Egypt, their theory was shelved. Requests for further joint studies into ignition sources and fire propagation were denied. The door had closed. Yet what they uncovered points to a critical vulnerability, one that echoes previous tragedies, like the EgyptAir Flight 111 fire in 1998, where an onboard fire originating from flammable insulation brought down an MD-11 or ValueJet Flight 592, which crashed due to oxygen generators improperly stored in the cargo hold. In all these cases, the lesson is painfully clear. Oxygen can save lives, but if mishandled, it can also destroy. In every cockpit, tucked behind the pilot's seat or mounted beside it, lies a device built for survival. The oxygen mask, a vital line of defense in emergencies designed to protect the crew from smoke, depressurization, and chaos. But what happens when the very system meant to protect becomes the system that destroys? Before every flight, pilots are required to test the oxygen masks. It's a simple but essential check. First, they confirm that the oxygen supply system is active. Then, they verify that the cockpit loudspeakers are on. They press and hold the test box reset button to open the solenoid valve, allowing oxygen to flow, just as it would in an actual emergency. By pressing the emergency knob, they trigger a continuous flow of oxygen at positive pressure, listening for the telltale hiss through the loudspeakers to confirm both flow and mic function. After a few seconds, they release the knobs. If everything's working, the oxygen should stop flowing, and the cockpit should fall silent once again. The final press is a check for silence to ensure no unintended leaks remain. The test confirms both functionality and safety. Because in the realm of aviation, oxygen is not just a life giver, it's a potential killer that brings us to the real danger. A fire needs three things: fuel, heat, and oxygen. This is the fire triangle. But what most people don't realize is that the more oxygen you introduce into that equation, the less heat you need to ignite the fuel. In a high oxygen environment, like the one inside an aircraft's crew oxygen line, even materials that would never ignite under normal conditions can become explosively flammable. That's why oxygen delivery systems are among the most tightly regulated parts of any airplane's design. According to aviation certification standards, systems must be designed so that the probability of an oxygen-fed fire is extremely remote, defined statistically as between 1 in 100 million and 1 in a billion flight hours. But there's a problem. In an industry logging tens of millions of flight hours per year, even a 1 in a billion event is eventually going to happen. And it has. Over the past 2 decades, aviation has seen multiple incidents where oxygen systems have turned on their aircraft each time in a slightly different and often bizarre way. In 2009, a CRJ-200 was nearly destroyed in Florida when a junction box caught fire on the ground, igniting an oxygen leak in the cockpit. 2 years later, in 2011, an EgyptAir Boeing 777 was written off entirely after an oxygen leak near the first officer's mask started a fire just after boarding. No passengers were injured, but the aircraft was beyond saving. In 2008, a cargo Boeing 767 suffered a destructive blaze in San Francisco after a short circuit energized a spring inside the oxygen line, feeding a jump seat mask. It was a freak combination of mechanical and electrical failure, exactly the kind of unknown engineers dread. But the strangest case by far came in 2012 in Antalya, Turkey. A Boeing 737 was badly damaged when a fire erupted in the cockpit, triggered by a combination of perfume, a lit cigarette, and flowing oxygen. In this bizarre sequence, the captain's mask had been left in emergency mode, releasing continuous oxygen. When the captain lit a cigarette against all regulation, the alcohol-rich cologne he had applied mixed with the oxygen flow. Witnesses in the cockpit saw a ball of sparks ignite, racing toward the oxygen outlet, and then flames. The captain tried to cut off the oxygen by pulling the mask from its box, but it was already too late. The cockpit became a firestorm. The crew barely escaped. The aircraft never flew again. What these stories reveal isn't just bad luck or procedural failures. They show how dangerous oxygen systems can be when a leak or misuse occurs, and how impossible it is to predict all the ways they can go wrong. Each incident involved a different aircraft, a different system, layout, and a different cause of ignition. And yet the result was the same fire in the cockpit: total loss of the aircraft, and only luck or timing stood between survival and tragedy. This is the backdrop against which the BEA's theory for Egypt, Air 804, becomes more credible. A flaw or undetected failure in the crew oxygen system, perhaps a leak near an electrical component. A short or an overheated part could have silently transformed the front of the aircraft into an oxygen-rich inferno. And unlike a bomb, this scenario doesn't require a perpetrator, a plan, or a breach of security. It only requires a system built to protect under rare conditions, turning rogue. As strange as it sounds, the evidence may point not to sabotage, but to a low-probability, high-consequence failure that we once believed to be nearly impossible. Statistically speaking, aircraft oxygen systems are remarkably safe. Over billions of flight hours, no passenger or crew member has ever died from an oxygen system failure alone. But that fact, while reassuring, masks a deeper truth. Nearly every oxygen-related fire in the cockpit, however rare, has occurred on the ground. Had any of those fires ignited mid-air with the aircraft sealed and flying at 37,000 feet, the consequences would have been catastrophic. And it's not just about the speed of the fire or its ability to incapacitate the crew. The real problem is far more sinister. These fires are nearly impossible to extinguish using the equipment available on board. That's what the French BEA discovered during its investigation into EgyptAir Flight 804. The halon fire extinguishers found in commercial aircraft cockpits, once thought to be universal suppressants, don't work against oxygen-fed fires. In fact, they can make the situation worse. Here's why. Halon doesn't cool the fire like water or foam. Instead, it interrupts the chemical chain reaction by bonding with oxygen molecules. But in an oxygen leak, new oxygen is constantly flowing. So the moment the cloud of halon dissipates, the fire reignites, because the fuel is still hot and the oxygen is still flooding in. Worse still, halon can react with burning material to create dense, toxic smoke, a lethal fog in the confined space of a cockpit. The BEA's tests confirmed that in such a scenario, the crew would stand little chance. And this brings us back to EgyptAir 804. The BEA began to assemble a list of reasons why they believed the crash wasn't caused by a bomb, but by a runaway oxygen fire. The first, and perhaps most telling clue, the very first abnormal sound on the cockpit voice recorder, wasn't a bang or a thud. It was a hiss, consistent with gas escaping under pressure. Not only that, but an acoustic analysis revealed something even stranger. The first officer's oxygen mask microphone had been active for at least 30 minutes before the incident, possibly the entire 2-hour flight. Now, how could that be? Well, the only way for the mask microphone to activate is if the valve supplying oxygen to the mask was open. Normally, that happens during an emergency or during a pre-flight test. But in this case, there was no emergency yet. The valve might have opened due to a mechanical fault, possibly linked to the press to test button, which interestingly had been reported stuck just 10 flights prior. Maintenance had replaced the entire oxygen mask box as a result. But BEA investigators believe the valve may have reopened unexpectedly on this or a previous flight. Crucially, even with the valve open, no oxygen would have flowed, not until a pressure differential existed, such as when the emergency knob was pressed or the mask was pulled out. But the system was now in a latent failure mode, quietly waiting for a trigger. With the mask mic active, even ambient sounds near the oxygen box like rustling paper or shifting books in the cockpit's document storage compartment would have been picked up and broadcast over the pilot's loudspeakers, provided they weren't using headsets. And on long-haul night flights, pilots often don't. For most of the flight, the crew was relaxed, chatting, listening to music. But just before the incident, both music and conversation trailed off. It was quiet. And in that silence, the first officer may have heard unfamiliar sounds, muffled thumps, or rustling from the oxygen box or nearby compartment. He may have suspected a mic malfunction or that the valve hadn't fully closed. Referring back to routine procedure, he may have pressed the emergency knob just to confirm, And that's when it began. At 0:25:24, the CVR captured a distinct hissing sound, lasting 2.6 seconds, exactly like oxygen being released under pressure. The sound was loudest on the first officer's audio channel, only faint on the others, proving it came from his side. Moments later, the hissing stopped. The captain said a word unintelligible, possibly a casual inquiry, then suddenly, a popping sound. Not the kind of sharp explosion associated with a bomb, but something more mechanical, perhaps a valve rupturing, or internal pressure forcing a seal to fail. Again, the sound was strongest on the first officer's channel. The BEA believes that what followed was an internal failure of the oxygen mask box, possibly triggered by a combination of the valve being open, the system flowing pure oxygen at emergency pressure, and an ignition source, perhaps electrical, perhaps chemical, perhaps static. Whatever it was, it didn't need much. In an oxygen-rich environment, even a warm surface or minor spark can ignite a fireball. The tragedy of Flight 804 may have begun not with a terrorist's device, but with a well-meaning pilot trying to isolate a fault in his mask, following the very procedure designed to ensure safety. Despite rigorous testing, ranging from lit cigarettes to battery fires to the impact of metal particles inside flexible oxygen lines, the BEA was unable to identify a single, definitive ignition source for what triggered the chain reaction inside EgyptAir Flight 804's cockpit. But in their final report, they were clear about one thing: it wasn't a cigarette. Contrary to some sensational media headlines at the time, there was no evidence the pilots were smoking in the cockpit. The claim was based on a mistranslation from the CVR, in which a phrase referencing a sick passenger was misheard as a conversation about smoking. That misunderstanding fed into a now discredited theory. In fact, the BEA explicitly refuted any smoking-related ignition in their findings. Instead, they pointed to a far more likely culprit, a short circuit similar to a prior incident in which electrical current energized a metal spring inside an oxygen line, causing combustion. That design flaw had since been addressed, but as previous cases had shown, no two oxygen fires are alike. And despite the BEA's efforts, the Egyptian judicial system withheld critical maintenance records and electrical fault logs, limiting the BEA's access to data that might have strengthened the short-circuit theory. Regardless of what precisely triggered it, the effect was instantaneous. Just seconds after the pop recorded on the cockpit voice recorder, the hissing sound returned, but this time it escalated, growing louder and more intense. This phenomenon is called a sound runaway, an acoustic signature of a pressurized oxygen leak gone out of control. Simultaneously, the fire that had likely sparked inside the oxygen mask box exploded into life. There was no smoldering phase, no delay. In a pressurized oxygen environment, ignition leads to blowtorching, a high-velocity jet of flame, blasting through metal wire, plastic, and human resistance. This wasn't theory. BEA lab tests demonstrated that with a 5-bar leak of pure oxygen, a small flame becomes a jet inferno. The CVR recorded this terrifying acoustic profile exactly. Within 2 seconds of the leak's onset, the first officer shouted, "Fire, fire," his voice raw, urgent, panicked. The captain and a flight attendant both joined in, also, yelling fire with growing alarm. The shock in their voices was unmistakable. 6 seconds later, the captain called for help. "Extinguisher, extinguisher. Bring it quickly." His voice was rising. He knew what was coming, but the fire had likely already reached the aft right side of the cockpit, precisely where the halon fire extinguisher was mounted. The one tool that might have helped was likely already engulfed or inaccessible. At some point, someone opened the cockpit door, likely to seek assistance or escape. The captain was heard yelling, "Close it," a desperate attempt to contain the blaze or keep the smoke from spreading. Whether the first officer remained in his seat is unknown. The heat from the flames, the proximity to the fire's source, and the cockpit's confined space would have made it nearly impossible to stay. The CVR provides no answer to who stayed and who fled. But someone did close the door again. By then it was too late. Smoke had already leaked from the cockpit into the forward galley and lavatory. That triggered the lavatory smoke alarm, which in turn set off a monster caution warning, a loud sequence of chimes and alerts echoing through both the galley and the cockpit. The BEA used this alarm's acoustic intensity to determine the status of the cockpit door. When the warning first sounded, the door was definitely closed, but no one responded. No voices, no movements. The first officer's audio channel went silent, likely destroyed as the fire consumed his side of the cockpit. The rest of the CVR began to degrade. Still some signals endured. The galley alarm continued repeating its harsh triple chime every 30 seconds. By the time it rang again, the cockpit door was evidently open. It was louder, clearer. But still, there were no signs of activity, no voice commands, and most crucially, no sound of a fire extinguisher being discharged. By now, vital systems behind the first officer's seat were failing one by one. The fire had reached the 120 VU panel, a major electrical node. At 00:27:18, 1110 seconds after the event began, the cockpit door remained open. 30 seconds later, it was closed again, though no one knows by whom or why. What was happening in that cockpit during those moments may never be fully known. But what is clear, painfully, irrevocably clear, is that by then, the cockpit was already beyond saving. As EgyptAir Flight 804 remained aloft, shrouded in darkness, 37,000 feet above the Mediterranean, the outside world had no idea that inside the cockpit, a silent disaster was already in motion. For 30 long seconds, Athens Area Control tried twice to instruct the crew to contact Cairo on frequency 124.7. There was no reply. Then, just 46 seconds after the lavatory smoke alarm had been triggered, a new warning appeared. Smoke had now reached the avionics bay, the compartment beneath the cockpit, where the aircraft's central computing systems are housed. The fire, which had likely started from a ruptured oxygen system, was spreading downwards through the floor vents. Systems were beginning to fail, one by one. What happened in the cockpit after that point remains a mystery. But the cockpit voice recorder reveals a haunting detail. 2.5 minutes after the fire began, someone was either still in the cockpit or had returned. The captain's microphone picked up the faint sound of breathing. Then something fell, an object clattering to the floor, followed by the voice of a man, broken and quiet, saying, "Ask forgiveness of God." A final prayer. The words of a pilot facing the unimaginable. At 3 minutes and 23 seconds, the oxygen hissing faded. The leak, which had fed the fire like a jet engine, went silent. The crew oxygen cylinder was likely empty. But by then, the damage had been done. The blaze was well established and there was no stopping it. One by one, vital aircraft systems continued to fail. Still, the background music incredibly continued to play eerily undisturbed. The rhythmic pulse of the modern cockpit juxtaposed with silence, fire, and death. Air traffic control kept calling. No response. Another EgyptAir crew, hearing the tension on the frequency, called out to the first officer by name, hoping to reach their friend. They never got an answer. No one knows where the first officer was at that moment. He might have fled to the cabin. He might have collapsed in the cockpit. We will never know. At 00:29:39, the fire damage systems caused the autopilot to disconnect. The CVR captured the familiar cavalry charge tone, an urgent warning to retake control manually, but no one did. No one could. The CVR ended 6 seconds later, the aircraft still holding altitude, still flying empty, burning leaderless. And then, like so many ghost flights before it, Flight 804 entered what's known as a graveyard spiral. With no hands at the controls and no systems to correct its flight path, the aircraft began to bank first gently, then ever more steeply into tighter and tighter orbits. The descent was long drawn out and terminal. Over the next 9 minutes, it spun downward toward the ocean. The emergency locator transmitter ELT Activated, early investigators believe this wasn't triggered by impact, but by a short circuit caused by the fire, which had now likely damaged the wiring of the activation switch. And there was more recovered wreckage from the business class cabin, charred and blackened, showed that the fire had spread beyond the cockpit. Somehow, flames had escaped the flight deck and reached the passenger area. What happened back there in the final minutes before the aircraft struck the sea is a horror we can only imagine. In 2023, after years of silence, the French BEA submitted its report to the Egyptian investigation authorities, urging them to publish a final unified account, not for politics, but for safety. Then, in October 2024, Egypt finally released its report. It reaffirmed the bomb theory, but tellingly, it also attached the BEA's full report as an unchanged appendix. Why Egypt stood by the explosive theory remains unknown. No suspect was ever identified. No terrorist group claimed responsibility. No traceable device was ever found. The supposed TNT residue, despite its prominence in the official narrative, was never independently verified. But the BEA's version, built from black box data lab tests, system diagrams, and acoustic forensics, tells a story that feels painfully real. Not sabotage, but systems failure. A silent, deadly flaw in the oxygen delivery system, one that ignited the cockpit and left the crew powerless. And the tragedy goes deeper. Because this failure, this one-in-a-billion nightmare, could have been investigated and addressed much sooner had the wreckage been fully recovered, the systems fully examined, and the data fully shared. For 8 years, that didn't happen. In its final recommendations, the BEA urged ESA, Airbus, and the oxygen system manufacturer to immediately test for overpressure failures, valve malfunctions, and ignition scenarios. The BEA had not been allowed to explore. And they didn't stop there. They also called for new firefighting protocol systems that can actually fight cockpit oxygen fires, because right now they can't. And yet, amid the heartbreak, something extraordinary happened without full access, without investigative authority, and without wreckage. The BEA kept going, out of principle, out of duty, out of the belief that aviation safety is a responsibility, not a report. Thanks to their relentless work, the industry now sees what went wrong. And because of that, changes will come: new safeguards, new training, new design. Maybe even a cockpit extinguisher that actually works. Flight 804 is not just a tragedy. It is a warning, one that finally has a voice, thanks to those who refuse to let the fire be forgotten.